Hi there, my name's Ian Willoughby and you're listening to Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My guest this time out is Veronika Tuckerová, who's from Prague but has been living in the US for some years. Veronika has been teaching Czech Studies at Harvard University for a decade now, but she's also done extensive research into the Prague German-language author Franz Kafka. Indeed, the academic is currently preparing a book entitled Reading Kafka in Prague, The Reception of Franz Kafka in Czechoslovakia, which mainly looks at changing perceptions of the writer in the communist period, when his works were for the most part banned. And I spoke to Veronika Tuckerová for this edition of Prague Talk. Preparing to publish a book, Reading Kafka in Prague, The Reception of Franz Kafka in Czechoslovakia. What led you to Kafka?
Well, what led me originally to Kafka is simply being from Prague and reading some of his works, which I had an access to, even though he was not published in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. But we had some of his books in translation at my parents' library. And I read his number of his works. Of course, at that time, Kafka was very meaningful to my generation as someone from Prague and as someone who was banned and someone who captured what we felt was our everyday lives. So we were reading the books with friends and to each other and exchanging the works. And then when I came and studied for comparative literature degree in New York, I wanted to mentally be back in Prague in some way. And I ended up working on Kafka, even though I think if I was in Prague, I would always read Kafka, but not necessarily do research, because the perspective changed for me radically. In Prague, I thought, oh, it's such a cliche. Everyone knows him, everyone has read him, there can't be anything new to find out. And I was very much surprised later on that there is actually so much to still find out about the way he was read in communist Czechoslovakia.
When was he first read in Czechoslovakia at all? I mean, when did Czech readers first get access to the works of Kafka?
So there were some of his works that came out during his lifetime, but of course in German. So there had to be mediators for people who didn't read German necessarily. But for example, already in 1920, his story, The Stalker, was published by the very famous and important Czech journalist Milena Jesenská, the addressee of Kafka's letters. And then in the late 1920s, there were a few stories here and there. But interestingly enough, or paradoxically, his big novels were only published much later, delayed. So The Castle in 1935 in Czech, and The Trial as late as 1958.
The Trial was actually translated decades before that, right? So why did it take so long for The Trial to actually come out in Czech?
The translator, Pavel Eisner, translated the novel towards the end of the war when he himself was hiding. And he tried to publish the novel. Actually, he argued since the late 1920s for the publication in Czech, and it never came about. And then there was this short window between 1946 and 1948, and there was a plan to publish collected works of Kafka in Czech, but it didn't happen because of the communist takeover in 1948, and that whole project fell apart. So only again, then there was a small window of opportunity after the thaw in 1956, and there was really just like 2 years when this was possible, 56 to 58, and then there was yet again more of a politically more intense situation. So that's little window that he had.
One name that stands out in the book is Eduard Goldsticker, who's a fascinating character in his own right. But what role did he play in perceptions of Kafka in Czechoslovakia?
So Eduard Goldsticker came from Slovakia. He studied German in Prague at the university. And in 1963, he was among several people, or sort of young scholars younger scholars who decided that they would like to explore why Kafka is so problematic for the communist orthodoxy. He even says it in his memoir that he published in 1989 in Germany. Well, we wanted to explore why did the officials so much dismissed him and would not allow Kafka to be published. So he called forth this famous conference that took place in 1963 in the little castle of Liblice that belonged to the Academy of Sciences. And it was interesting because it was a conference about Kafka for a selected group of Marxist scholars from Czechoslovakia and from abroad. And it was at a time when Kafka's books were not available in Czech. Even the researchers and the scholars who presented, they had to scramble to find the books. And the conference was really not about the author as we imagine it today, but some of the major papers were about, is Kafka relevant for our society in the early 1960s? Is he only symptomatic of the bourgeois capitalist alienation, or is the kind of alienation that he portrays also present in our society? And the event was observed or monitored by the secret police or by all the sort of state agencies, and the presenters and the organizers were worried that it would be stopped at any time, but it wasn't. And after that week of conferencing, Kafka started being published in Czech after that long kind of gap.
And how did Goldsticker view Kafka?
Well, Goldsticker is, of course, a very interesting character because he himself was tried and sentenced in the early 1950s in association with the very infamous Slansky trial, and he was sentenced as a former diplomat for life in prison, but he was released. So I was thinking how someone who had such experience with communist repressive system and being sentenced for crimes that he did not himself, that were completely constructed, fabricated, how he read Kafka's trial and other works. Like, was there any kind of sense of identification and how that exactly worked?
Well, you say that Goldsticker didn't identify his own personal reality with Kafka's reality, but some in the Czech dissent did. They did see a parallel between Kafka and themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that Goldsticker was just too scholarly to admit, or in his personal or in his sort of public work, that kind of identification would just seem not scientific enough. But he was concerned with his own sense of guilt for the rest of his life. And I think it really goes to the core of the novel as well.
Well, you write also that Ivan Klima said about In the Penal Colony that no literature had affected him so deeply. Was it the case also that some in the dissent saw Kafka as a kind of prophet of totalitarianism, that he had kind of foreseen the totalitarian society? So
Goldsticker himself was, or there were other people who kind of made that connection, but more to, I would say in dissent, it was more about the everydayness during the communist era, kind of recognizing the situations that were described in Kafka's fiction as the kind of living or lived experience that they themselves went through on everyday basis. Of course, also when you mention Ivan Klima, I think he was referring specifically to his experience in the Terezin ghetto and making that kind of connection to Kafka's works and the penal colony. And then, of course, we have the 1980s figures such as Václav Havel, Jiřina Šiklová, Milan Šimečka, who were in prison for their dissident activities. And they all described the prison experience as being scripted by Kafka.
Another fascinating fact in your book is when you say that Bohumil Hrabal created the word Kafkarna, which means like a kind of Kafkaesque, absurd situation. So
there are several theories about how that word came about. So it's not a conclusive argument. So, but he named a collection. Actually, one of his stories, Kafkarna. But some other people say that the word already existed in the group 42, group of artists and writers established in 1942, and that Hrabal was so close to them, he used it.
One thing that I was kind of vaguely aware of before reading the book, but your book makes it very clear, Václav Havel seems to have had a very deep affinity with Kafka. He even said, somehow, I understood him better than others did.
That's precisely so. So first he wrote about his attitude towards Kafka in such explicit way in one of his letters from the Ruzyně prison to his wife Olga. And there he writes that he is reading Max Brod's memoir while in prison, and why it is that he never cared much for theoretical interpretations, that he never wanted to read any of that. And the reason is that he understands Kafka better than anyone else who could mediate for him. And then he repeats it again, almost verbatim, but also elaborates on it in 1919 when he was given the honorary degree in Jerusalem. And he says, even if Kafka didn't write his work and I was a better writer, I would have written it even better, which somehow I think really displays, and of course irony and sarcasm on Havel's side, but a very thin kind of line, because I think he just so much lived and absorbed Kafka's work, and of course it's, we can't take it completely serious. It wasn't that he really thought that he would be so capable. But it's kind of like the intimacy. I think it's really about the intimacy. And he wasn't the only one who at that time really, the famous underground superstar Egon Bondy walks around Prague in a Samizdat film from 1983. And then he comes to the bust or relief of Kafka on his birthhouse. And he says, it's pity that the one for whom this bust was made here is not here with us today, because he would have that's when he would finally feel at home here with us.
Also, Ivan Martin Jiros, Magor, Madman, the poet, he also made a lot of references to Kafka.
There is a wonderful piece of memoir by Ivanka Lefebvre where she describes how her friends from underground would sit and Jiros would be reading from Kafka's work to this group of people, and they would all be listening in silence. And Jiros would kind of actualize or concretize that reading and refer to the occupation, to the Soviet-led occupation in 1968. Jiros also already much earlier in the early 1960s was transcribing on a typewriter some of the unavailable texts as very early samizdat, and was distributing it among his friends.
My final question today, how do you think Kafka is perceived here in Czechia?
When I came here in June, I was actually very surprised. I didn't expect that there would be such, as a friend named it, Kafka mania, that he would be so much remembered.
That was for the centenary.
Yeah, for the centenary since his death, and of course it's a good thing, because many of the events that were organized were very meaningful. Some of the exhibitions, some of the conferences, workshops, and so forth. But it's very superficial impression that I had, because I don't live here, so I wouldn't want to really judge how much he is read. What is disappointing is that his works are not available in Czech in good editions. So that's certainly something that I feel should have been done for the centenary, or at least soon. But I, for example, heard from a high school teacher who mentioned that her students, and this was in Ostrava, in Silesia, that her students are absolutely bedazzled by Kafka, that they read him, that they love his letters, they so much identify with this kind of indecisiveness and the life through writing rather than through living it. And she made that connection with the young generation today, just really living on social media more than in reality, and they sort of like connected to that.
Many thanks indeed to Veronika Tuckerová for that interview. Her book, Reading Kafka in Prague, The Reception of Franz Kafka in Czechoslovakia, should be out next year on the Bloomsbury Academic imprint. Prague Talk is a podcast from Radio Prague International, and if you're new to the pod and enjoyed this one, why not check out some of the earlier editions? There are around 100 of them out there for your listening pleasure. I'm Ian Willoughby saying thank you for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.